Hello, everyone, and welcome to the BuzzStream Podcast. My name is Vince Nero. I'm your host, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Rosie Taylor. She's a freelance journalist in the UK covering health and consumer, and she is also the founder of the Get Featured Substack, which is a great Substack I recommend for all PRs to check out. Thanks, Rosie, for joining us. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Quick note before we get started, I just want to remind everyone to like and subscribe so I can keep having great guests like Rosie on this podcast. So it's a little different episode for us, I think, because normally we kind of have been focusing more on the strategy side and the PR side of things, pitching. But now I'd love to use this as an opportunity to talk about what it's like to be on the other side, the receiving end of our pitches. And honestly, like the reason I really wanted to do this was, we promote this idea of like personalizing pitches, avoiding the big blasts. And I think that's where the industry is going. That's where Google wants a lot of people to go. So I think it's also like puts a face to what it is PRs do, like lets people, reminds them that there's another person, an actual person on the other side of these things. So let's start there, Rosie. You work as a freelancer. I know you did some work in-house. I'd love to just get your sense of what a day in the life is like for a freelance journalist these days.
Okay, that's a good question. It's interesting what you were saying about putting a human face to the other side of the kind of emails, because I do find that sometimes that people sometimes forget that journalists are human beings. And maybe journalists are a little bit guilty of forgetting that PRs are human beings too sometimes. But certainly when I do media training for spokespeople, sometimes they're like, oh, wow, a real journalist, they have to speak to them. I'm like, I am also a person. You're like a CEO. I'm much more scared of you. But yeah, sometimes journalists, I don't know why we have a kind of reputation as being other, somehow different from normal everyday people doing their jobs. And it's definitely not the case. In my job, I guess probably the same as everyone else. I start by going through my emails, looking at pitches that have come in and looking at pitches that I've sent as well. Because as a freelancer, I'm in the kind of unique position that I do see both sides of the fence. So I get pitched to by PRs, lots of them on a daily basis. But I also have to pitch. That's how I make a living. So I pitch my ideas to editors. And in a lot of cases, I'm pitching to exactly the same editors that the PRs I deal with are also trying to get in front of. That's kind of like one of the reasons why I started the Featured Substack, was to try and kind of explain how I pitch and what works and what doesn't work from this position as someone that both receives those pitch emails and has to send them. So.
Yeah, it's a great position to be in for you, especially as an educator. And yeah, like I said in the intro, I highly recommend checking it out. I was reading one that you did recently, and you actually kind of linked to an older post that you did about subject lines, the best things that stand out to you. And you gave a little snapshot of your inbox. And it was, one of those, like, as a PR, you're setting out, like, you can kind of, like we have our own email inboxes, but like to see it in action, to see everybody's pitches. It's like when you send a pitch, you think it's the most important thing in the world, right? Like, there's no way the journalist is going to ignore this. But like, then you see inbox and you see how easily it can be ignored or skipped or missed or whatever. So I think it's like maybe a good segue into kind of the second question of what stands out to you? How do you recommend people stand out? What we're up against?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think I did a kind of little audit of my inboxes when I was writing that post about what makes me open an email. And I think there was quite a quiet day, but I think about 2/3 of the emails I got were pitches. And obviously kind of like the rest of the emails were stuff that I also had to deal with. So it was like editors getting in touch, asking questions, or interviewees with like information or set up interviews. So that's kind of like stuff I have to action. And then on top of that, there's like this huge kind of like, I guess twice as many emails a day that I receive that are cold pitches essentially. And most of them I ignore. It was about 5%, I think, that I open. And what kind of makes me open one? The most obvious answer is that it's obviously for me and not a kind of generic email that's been sent out everywhere. I guess there's a caveat to that, which is when I was working in-house as a journalist covering a certain beat, my job was to cover breaking news that happened on that beat. So, whether it was health or business, I've covered different patches over the years. But if something was being sent out and it was urgent and it was quite clearly being sent to all my competitors, when I was doing that job, I would probably open the email as long as the subject line made clear that it was an interesting story or a relevant topic, because I needed to know what was going on. But now, I'm much more only I don't cover breaking news anymore, basically. So I only am interested in exclusives or stories that I can work on kind of a longer term basis. So that makes it really easy for me to ignore kind of 90% of the emails that I get from PRs, because a lot of stuff are these wide scattergun releases that are just this is happening today, please pay attention. So basically I just ignore those. And so I open stuff where it's just, I don't know, it's not just that it's, I cover health, but I specifically am interested in women's health, for example. So when it's really obvious from the subject line that this is a topic that I'm interested in, or, it's really clear from the subject that it starts exclusive, or this is a story for you at one, they name some of the publications that I write for, or, launching next week, there's sense of urgency about it, but would you like an exclusive ahead of time? All of that kind of stuff that just shows they've thought a bit about who I am, who I write for, kind of stories I do. And it is a bit of a weird situation as a journalist, because there's kind of so few of us compared to the number of people working in PR industry. And it is this kind of weird imbalance relationship where for every like you said, as a PR, you might send one email, but that journalist has just received 50 from your competitors. So it is hard to stand out. And sometimes I feel a little bit as a journalist, we're oh, have you not researched me? It seems a little bit arrogant to sort of say, oh, you should know who I am and what I do. But really, that is so important, because that is key, basically, to standing out. I mean, most of the emails I receive are so generic. So anything that isn't, basically, as soon as I can see something isn't generic and something's actually oh, hi, Rosie, I saw you write a lot for this publication. I wondered if you could be interested in this topic. I'm oh, they actually have done their research a little bit. And, that always appears. I always open those emails and at least try and reply if someone's made the effort to tailor it to me. I guess there's another element to that, which is also having a bit of an awareness of the type of stories a journalist writes. So you might be a health reporter, but you only do long form investigations. You're probably not going to cover a listicle or I'm a podiatrist and here are 5 things you need to know about your feet, that kind of thing. But there are other journalists that's what they do, and they're looking for that kind of quick turnaround content, and they're happy to have those kind of pictures. I'm not unhappy to have those kind of pictures, but I'm rarely going to cover them because, they can be done in-house. So it's not just topic, I think, that you need to match. It's also the kind of type of journalism that someone is.
Yeah, I love that. That is such great advice. I feel like that's the kind of thing that you don't get, on the PR side. A lot of it is media database based work, right? So you find, if you want to, you do a search for women's health journalists, right? You might show up, but yeah, if you're not writing listicles, if you're getting pitched listicles, it's not going to work. So that's great advice. One thing you mentioned was this idea of covering breaking news. I mean, that kind of fits in that same category of understanding what type of content the journalist actually does. Would you say, do all freelancer journalists not cover breaking news? Is that kind of just an in-house role type of coverage?
I mean, I wouldn't like to sort of generalize, but I mean, I think generally breaking news is something that's covered in-house. So you might be a freelancer that works shifts for a publication and you'll cover whatever happens to be going on your shift. But yeah, it's still sort of done kind of from a centralized publication perspective. It's not something, I wouldn't really pitch a breaking news story unless it was my exclusive that I'd found the story and I kind of created the breaking news, if something happens out in the world, then I guess that's generally covered in-house. But having said that, there's always spin-offs that are commissioned to freelancers. So if there's a big celebrity announcement, a celebrity has an unusual health condition, for example, freelancers like me will be commissioned to find someone that has the same health condition, or do a first person piece about what it involves, or interview an expert about, do you have this health condition? What are the signs to look out for? All of that kind of stuff. But the actual kind of news story that this announcement has happened would likely be covered in-house or by news agencies.
Yeah. It might be helpful actually to have you kind of break down the difference between a freelancer and an in-house. I feel like that might clear up some of this stuff for listeners too, and myself.
Yeah. So I realize also like journalists are really guilty sometimes of using loads of like weird archaic lingo that like other people who aren't in the industry might not understand. So I guess in-house just means like you're employed directly from a news publication. So, that might be The Guardian, or Daily Mail, Times. And you are like an employee of that publication. You'll have a specific role there. You might be covering breaking news or general news, or you might have like a beat that you cover like health or science or tech or whatever. And generally you kind of rock up to work and you cover, depending on what you do, but like if you're a news reporter, you would cover kind of what's going on in that area on that day. And you're also kind of responsible for bringing in exclusive stories. And that's what I'll go into that in a minute. And that's kind of your job. So, and in Freelancers, we're not employed by anybody. We're self-employed, and you can either kind of shift for publication, or you can pitch ideas to generally kind of like more long-term stuff like features or news features, or news exclusives, I guess. And then, journalism is quite a difficult industry to make a living in. So generally as freelancers also have side hustles. So I do a lot of media consultancy, got my Substack, and I do webinars and things like that on kind of all sorts of topics like pitching to the media and like what makes a news story, or that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, I want to kind of switch into some of the tactical stuff that I think would be helpful for listeners to know. So when I'm pitching you, so we kind of covered the subject line, it's got to be relevant, it's got to be personalized somewhat in the short amount of space that we have, right? But let's be kind of more generally like, what can a PR do to make your life easier?
So in terms of a pitch, I mean, I always say that like making a journalist's life easier is like a massively underestimated kind of skill. Because if you can nail that, then your chances of your pitch being accepted are like way higher. Basically, journalists are like hugely overworked at the moment. Like it's such a crazy time for the industry. There's lots of kind of like job changes going on, and people are kind of being landed with like more responsibilities and, extra stuff like having to upload content, or, there's also kind of been so much crazy breaking news going on in the world for the past few years. And I just think, kind of resources are super stretched. So anything you can do to make a journalist's life like easier, the better. And by that, I mean, if you pitch a journalist an idea, they have to turn that into a story that's publishable on their website or in a physical publication. And it's never just words. It's never just kind of a summary of what's happened. There are like various elements of the story that we need. So we might need independent experts to comment. We might need a case study. We need pictures of those, maybe graphics or like a table of information to go with it. And I always just say, like, the more of that you can provide up front, like, hey, I actually already contacted an independent expert and they're available for interview next week. Or, here's a case study and we've got some high-res photos that we already took and you can have them. All of that kind of stuff that makes the story more page ready, then the more likely you are to get yes. And pitching something that is a story rather than an idea. So I get a lot of pitches that are kind of about these really broad concepts, like, hey, it's back to school season. Would you like a story about going back to school? And like, well, that's not really, that's a very broad subject that doesn't really nail anything down, whereas it's much more like, did you know that kids going back to school this year are like 5 times more likely to, I don't know, have head lice than last year or something, like something that's actually like new. This is a bit different. There's something tangible here.
I think one of the questions I had kind of thinking about your role, you kind of said, as a freelancer, you're kind of in this unique space where you're pitching to editors, right? So you kind of understand what it takes to get a story sold. And as a journalist, you know what it takes to get a great pitch. So you're kind of in the ideal spot, right? To at least understand, all this. If you were to, talk to a PR, are we best pitching to someone like you or a in-house journalist? Do you think it makes a difference these days?
I think it can make a difference. So the thing with in-house journalists is they just have like so much to do. and they have so many emails coming in because they have a lot more emails, say from like editors and, like kind of day-to-day admin stuff that they have to deal with. So I've been on staff as well. So I'm just, talking from that perspective, I got hundreds of emails a day. Sometimes I've managed to cut it right down now to about 50, which is very freeing. But yeah, so I think, if you pitch directly to staff, then obviously you're much more likely to get it in that target publication, maybe. But it is harder, I would say, to get their attention. And they just don't have time often, not always, but like often they don't have time to build up a story. So unless you're presenting something that's like pretty much everything they need already there, then it can be difficult, even if they're interested in the idea, to get them to actually follow through with it. I'm sure some of your colleagues have experienced, like, Janice can sort of be, oh yeah, this is quite interesting, I'll get back to you. And then they just don't. So I guess with pitching to a freelancer that works for those publications that you're trying to target anyway, you've got a kind of way in. So one of the reasons that it works pitching to freelancers is because generally we kind of only get paid when we land a story. It's called payment on publication, and it's a very terrible practice. But basically it means we have a vested interest in like landing anything that we work on, making sure that it's published. So I realize I'm using lingo there when I'm saying landing. So if we like do work and we invest in a story, we really want to see it through. We wouldn't going to want to see it published in a publication. And we do also have the flexibility, like if it doesn't work for one publication, if the editor changes their mind or they don't commission it in the first place, we can take it somewhere else. Whereas a staff journalist is kind of stuck, like that's all they can do. But the other thing from a kind of PR perspective is that because of that dynamic that we have with our editors, freelance journalists are not going to say yes to your story unless they really think it's going to work. So you kind of avoid that situation that you do sometimes have with staff journalists. And I only say this remembering what I was like on staff, where you're like, oh yeah, that is kind of interesting. And then they just sit on it. They don't do anything about it. I'm, as a freelance now, I'll just say, I just don't think it quite works for me. I'll be more honest, I guess, more upfront. And I can't speak for all freelancers or all in-house journalists, but I think sometimes it's an easier dynamic working with a freelancer. And then you've also got the added advantage that if we take on your story and we pitch it to editors, they're just so much more likely to open an email from us because of that existing relationship. They know that I wouldn't pitch something that wasn't good enough for them, really, I guess. Or, I guess more they know that I know what they want and I'm going to send them something that hopefully they want. So they're just much more likely to open the email than, you could pitch basically exactly the same thing as a PR. It's no reflection on the quality of your pitch. It's just literally having that existing relationship that can be really powerful in kind of editors just paying attention or not, just because they're so time strapped.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of one of the reasons we talk about personalizing and building relationships with journalists in general, is because it lowers that barrier to entry and you understand what they like and you kind of lean on, you've helped them out in the past, and it just makes it that much easier rather than just I don't know if you're familiar with the terminology on the PR side, which I hate, is like the spray and pray approach. But yeah, I think it makes so much more sense in general to work towards building relationships rather than just shooting out to whoever you can get.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally appreciate it's so much harder to build relationships than it used to be because people are just really busy or they work from home and they're not around. This idea that like you take journalists out for lunch is just kind of feels quite old fashioned now, right? But I mean, we also have like social media, and I make relationships with people who have contacted with me on Instagram or LinkedIn or, and actually just people that have sent me really great pictures in the past. Then as soon as, I said yes to a cold pitch, then we have an ongoing relationship, and I will always read new emails that they send me, even if I can't take on another one of their pitches for like years. I still know who they are, and we have that relationship. So it's just making that first contact, I guess.
That's great advice. And you mentioned a couple other kind of inroads outside of just email. You mentioned like Instagram, social media. I mean, is it just a matter of like saying hi, telling them, you liked their piece, that if you really did? I mean, obviously you can fake that. It can get pretty.
I mean, so I'd always kind of urge caution with maybe pitching via social media.
but more so just like saying hello, right? Like making the connection is kind of more
Yeah, exactly. So like, I mean, I guess the two main social media platforms I use for work are Instagram and LinkedIn, and I use them in really different ways. So my Instagram is basically like largely I'm focused on my women's health work, and I follow a lot of people in the women's health world, like industry experts and patients and advocates. And, we kind of like and follow each other's stuff, and you just get to kind of know each other, even though you don't actually know each other, but you have a feeling that you know people because you like engage with their work online. So, that's kind of one way of doing it. I wouldn't, if someone just DMs me cold on Instagram, I tend to ignore it. But if it's someone that like, we have this kind of reciprocal social relationship with, and then after a while they were like, oh, I've read your things, and I've got a similar story I want to share, then of course I'll engage with that. And LinkedIn obviously is very different. It's very like much more of a work networking thing. But again, like, I think there's nothing wrong with saying, oh, hey, I saw your article, I thought it was really interesting. But, it is also really obvious to journalists when you're faking that. Like, our job is to like notice like BS basically. So like we do notice, like it is obvious, especially like, even when you email like, hey, I saw your article about, and it's quite obviously like the first thing that came up on Google when you looked us up, like we can tell you don't have to love what we've done before. It's about being authentic.
Yeah, we've gotten that. It's funny. I've heard from some journalists who have said, oh, I really appreciate it, like when people call it out and say that they like it. But, and then I've heard the other side where it's like, yeah, it can, the problem is it can backfire on you if it's not authentic. And
and I think we can all tell when something's authentic. Like I really, when people say, oh, I really liked your article about this, you can tell whether they mean it or not. There's normally something like, oh, a similar thing happened to me, or that really resonated with me because of X, Y, and Z. It doesn't need, you don't need to write a kind of essay about it. You just like, in the same way, like if you met me, in the street and we're like, oh, hi, I saw you posted about that and that was really interesting or something, like it doesn't have to be a lot, but like, it's just really obvious when it seems like really robotic or I've had it where someone said, oh, I really enjoyed your article about X and Y. And like, I know that was like a really boring listicle or something. I'm like, okay, obviously like you looked at the headline, but you haven't read this terrible article that I wrote one time.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't do a ton of pitching myself anymore. I used to when I was on the agency side, but I would always kind of find myself going more towards like their bio, the journalist bio, to see if there's any connection I could make there, sports fans or whatever. We grew up in the same town or something like that that helped cut through.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just think it's like any conversation. This is what I mean about people sometimes not remembering that journalists are human people, just like the rest of us, like human beings, like the rest of us. It's like, like what would you say if you were in the room with that person and you walked up to them and were doing your elevator pitch, you wouldn't, you'd say something like, oh, hi, I see you follow the same sports team, or, oh, I see you're really interested in, I write a lot about kind of like maternal health and rights around birth and things like that. And so, I do actually get quite a lot of strangers coming up to me and telling me some terrible things that happened to them during like pregnancy and birth, which is great, like, I'm like, that's lovely that you can feel so open. But like, I guess it's finding something that people have a connection.
Right. Just like real life, yeah.
Just like real life, just treat it like real life. And I think, sometimes we get so caught up in like thinking about the logistics of like the internet and how the internet works. And, especially if you're coming from a digital PR perspective and you're sort of focused on things like links and SEO and stuff like that, you can sometimes forget that journalism is actually just about talking to people. Like, that's all we do. We're just trying to talk to our readers and get information across and interest people, basically.
Yeah. So true. You mentioned something there at the end, and I did. Well, when we first spoke a few days ago, you said it was interesting to kind of watch a few of my podcasts and kind of see the other side of things, right? And kind of a few things like to you of like why PRs do what they do. What were some of those, if you don't mind sharing? I think you mentioned one about like the links thing of like asking for links.
Yeah, so I think this is the thing. I think there is, I guess there's always been this kind of like a bit of a kind of tension between journalism and PR, and journalists complain that PRs don't understand the industry and vice versa. And And I think, especially with when you have people working in PR who have never experienced journalism, it can be hard to understand how it works. And I get that. But I think maybe in some ways that gulf has got even bigger now with the rise of digital PR, and that you have people who don't even maybe have a background in PR. They have a background in link building and SEO and stuff like that. And then they realize that they want to move into digital PR. But then the kind of gulf between their expectations and journalist expectations can be quite big. And I'm only in my mid-30s, but I trained as a print journalist. I am still basically a print first journalist, although a lot of my work is online or online first or online only now. But, even, I'd like to think I'm not a dinosaur, but actually I've never been, I've never had any kind of formal training in any of the kind of backroom stuff. So affiliate links or SEO or I, as a freelancer, I don't have any access to the content management systems of websites. I have no control over whether links are put on my articles or not. That is done something
that's a big one.
Yeah, exactly. It's done way up the editing chain. It may not even be done by editors. Sometimes it's done by a separate team, the publication's SEO team. And sometimes people say to me oh, could you add a link in? I don't even know who I would ask. I don't know who does it. It's so far removed from.
That's a great PSA. Freelancers rarely have any control over that. If you were to add a link or something in your document that you submitted to an editor, once it gets in the editor's hands, it's totally out of your hands, right?
Yeah, and it's not just for freelancers. I would say that was for in-house journalists as well. The decision as to whether to publish the link on the website may not even be made by the section editor. It may be made by the kind of online team and that.
Yeah.
So yeah, and we're kind of coming from two different worlds in a way. Journalism's still kind of really clunky and old and archaic in some ways. A lot of the time I literally just file plain text by email, and that's the last I see of it. I might get some questions, and then a few days later it will be published on a website with pictures and links and bullet points and captions and a URL slug and all of these things that I've had nothing to do with. And yeah, but I do appreciate why people ask for links and that they need them. I think a lot of journalists might not understand that, but I guess I've been doing a lot more work with PRs. So I do kind of see it more from that side of the coin. So, one thing that I advise people to do is when they tell me what their business name is, to actually just basically give me their website. So if they're a photographer and it's I don't know, they run a site called I Love Wedding Photos or something, I will literally put them in as Joe Blogs, who runs iloveweddingphotos.com, and then put that as his company name. And then I just then it might get put as a link in the copy. Yeah. Because sometimes it looks a bit weird to have a URL like that without a link. But also I think it does still, you have to correct me on this, but I think it can still help with Google rankings and stuff, because you've got the name in a trusted publication. Yeah. So I do sometimes try and do that to kind of help people out. But, a lot of journalists might not, I say, we have no training in this, a lot of us. There are, people who have come from that background or have a lot of training in that area, but I'd still say the majority of journalists are shocked and confused by why you might be demanding a link and just think, that's...
Well, I don't think it should ever be a demand, right?
Yeah.
There's a whole strategy, unlinked mentions, where it's you're an agency, you provide that as a service, where it's we're going to go around and see anytime your brand was mentioned and go reach out to that website and see if they can add a link. It's just finding way, it's like anything. It's just finding ways to scale whatever you find out works, right? What can we pump out? And that's where we run into a lot of the friction, I think, is especially the agency side. There's such a focus on links for one, but scale and getting as much bang for your buck, right? So that's why there's so many emails that get sent out. And I think there's still that big divide of the people that do large scale email bursts to anybody. You just find a media list. I want a wellness, a women's health journalist. You might just be on that list. They don't know anything about you. And you get that generic post or the generic pitch. But there's always going to be that divide, I think, unless, I don't know, just more pushback or something.
I think this is again where there's a kind of big mismatch in expectations, because from a journalist perspective, especially if adding a link is seen as like somehow affecting editorial independence, they will, journalism, it's very much something that still needs to be independent. And if you want to, very much like if you probably heard a million times, if you want an ad, you have to pay for it. If you want an affiliate link, then you can pay for it. And that's a separate thing. That's separate from independent journalism. I saw a post on LinkedIn recently where someone was saying that she quoted an expert in an article and then got this really kind of quite aggressive email afterwards saying like, if you don't add a link, we're going to make you retract the comment from the article. And it's just this like, again, this like such mismatch in what people are thinking. Like, I guess if you come from like maybe an influencer marketing background or working with blogs, then this idea that you provide content and you get a link as kind of payment for that content, and it's a kind of reciprocal arrangement makes sense. But from a journalism background, it's like, very much sometimes it's like you've been featured in like a publication that's been read by millions of people. Like your brand name is out there, it's in a trusted source. Like this is advertising you can pay for, you should be grateful for it. And no, like we don't have to quote you. And if you're going to be aggressive about it, we'll just delete your comment from the article. And I'm not saying that either of those things is right, but I think the problem is that you've got these two different perspectives and we're trying to work with each other and we fundamentally don't understand each other.
No, I think that exists in like the link building SEO realm as well. Like, there are people who just view it as a business rather than a personal connection and what it is. Press is press versus getting a link. Well, Rosie, I don't want to take up more of your time here. You've been very gracious with your time. One thing I did want to just pitch was I know you have a podcast. I know you, I think, haven't worked on it as frequently, but it's something I'd like to give my guests a quick shout out if they're ever working on something. You used to call Mother Bodies for mothers. It's in the women's health, I think, bucket that you cover. So if you want to talk a little bit about that, I think it would be great.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So my podcast is called Mother Bodies and it's about postnatal health and why it matters. And yeah, I've done 2 series with some really incredible guests. Really proud of some of the people that have come on. But yeah, I haven't been able to work on it for the last year because I need a sponsor to carry on. And basically, I've been too busy to look for a sponsor. So if anyone listening has any women's health clients out there or, who are interested in sponsoring podcasts, then feel free to get in touch. But yeah, I mean, basically, I interview guests. It's mainly them talking, me just nudging them in the right direction. And we talk about kind of the reality of what it's like to recover from birth, because it's not something that gets discussed that much. And why kind of like care and support is lacking and what we can do to change the world to make parents' lives for the better.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I have a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old. My wife is awesome. We've talked about this where it's like you get prenatal checkups, before the birth. And then it's like, all right, see you later.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Like kind of probably the time that you need care and support more than any other point in your entire life, you're kind of like left to spend for yourself. And I understand it's actually even a worse situation in the US than it is in the UK. So yeah, there's a lot to discuss. I don't think I ever tire of talking about that topic.
Yeah. So check it out. If you know of any sponsors or people that would be interested in helping out Rosie, give her a shout. Rosie, people can find you on your Substack, get featured. Sounds like Instagram and LinkedIn.
Yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn, always happy to connect. I'm on Instagram. Like I say, it's mainly kind of women's health chat on there and moaning about the state of journalism. So if that's your bag, then feel free to follow me. And yeah, you can sign up to my Get Featured Substack. Just Google Get Featured. I'm pretty sure it comes up. I should check that actually. I'm obviously like terrible at my own PR and SEO. So
we gotta get you some SEO. Yeah. No, I think it does. It comes up. Yeah. Rosie, thank you so much. Like I said, definitely subscribe for any PR. I think it's really helpful. She drops some really great stuff. And if you have any questions about any stuff we talked about, I'm sure Rosie would be more than happy to answer, leave it in a comment or, chat us up on LinkedIn. So again, thanks so much, Rosie. Thanks for listening, everybody.